In this video, I'll be going over naming ionic compounds, and this is just for simple binary ionic compounds. So to break that down, simple binary means that all of these elements, we're going to be able to predict the number of valence electrons they have, and then because of that, what ion they become. So basically, this means we're not dealing with any transition metals. So all the naming in this video will just be for all of those elements that we can completely predict what they want to do with electrons. And then as far as ionic compounds, that just means that we have a metal and a nonmetal. So I'm going to go over a few examples, both from going from chemical formula to name and from name to chemical formula. So let's start with just going over our general rules. And so our first element, that's always going to be the cation, which is the positive ion, and that's just the element name. So we look that guy up, and whatever it is, we're just going to name it. And so you always know, in this case, the metal is always going to come first. The metal is always a cation. And then the second element, the nonmetal, that's going to be the anion, the negative ion, and then that's going to have the same element name, but then we're going to replace that last syllable with the IDE ending, pronounced "ide." And so these are our two rules. And then just as a reminder, whenever we're doing any type of ionic compound naming, we don't use any prefixes. That's only when we're doing covalent. So let's just start with our first example. We have K2O. We look up K, we figure out that that is potassium. And that's really all we have to do, because our first element, we just say the element name. We don't have to indicate how many we actually have of this element in the name. And then for our second element, we see that O, we look up oxygen, and now we replace the last syllable with the IDE. Oxygen's a little bit of an exception. It actually becomes oxide. And so this is how we shorten it. And so the name for this is just potassium oxide. So we completely erase how many of each element we have going from chemical formula to name, which is going to make it a little bit harder when we're going from name to chemical formula. But before we do that, let's do one more example. So CaCl2. So we look up Ca, that's calcium. And then we look up Cl, and that's chlorine. And now this one's really straightforward. So the last syllable of chlorine is just "ene," and so we're going to now change that into IDE, to chloride. And so here's our name. All right, and so that's the easiest part. Honestly, out of all of naming, just doing this simple naming is probably the easiest you'll ever get.